If you've ever asked yourself, why can't I stick to a budget? No matter how hard you try, here's the truth. You didn't fail your budget. Your budget failed to account for what's actually happening in your brain. Here's the data point that should stop you cold. Over a quarter of Americans reported doom spending, driven by financial anxiety, spending habits tied to inflation, the cost of living, foreign affairs, and the election, and younger generations are at greater risk, with 37% of Gen Z and 39% of Millennials reporting doom spending. That's not a minority habit. That's over a third of an entire generation. But here's the number that nobody puts in the headline, and it's the one that actually matters for this video. Only 18% of people who doom spend say it actually made them feel better. Read that again. People are doing this specifically to feel better, and 82% of the time it doesn't work. That gap between what doom spending promises and what it delivers is not a willpower failure. It's a mechanism. And once you understand the mechanism, just budget better stops being useful advice because it was never treating the actual problem. This video is not going to give you a definition and a listicle. It's going to open up the anxiety spending loop, the anxiety relief cycle that's driving this behavior. Name the exact psychological trick, the one Gen Z coined a term for without realizing what they'd actually described, and then rebuild your budget around how your brain actually works, not how a finance influencer wishes it worked. If you've ever budgeted hard for a week, felt deprived, and then blown the whole thing on one purchase you can't fully explain, you're not broken. You're running a loop. Let's take it apart. The doom spending definition everyone gets wrong. Every article on this topic gives you the same definition. Doom spending is making impulsive or frivolous purchases in response to negative news or economic anxiety. Technically accurate. Practically useless. It's like defining a fire as the presence of smoke. You've described the symptom, not the ignition. The term itself is recent, but the behavior isn't. Doom spending isn't an entirely new phenomenon. James Mose, a professor of accounting and taxation at the University of New Haven, traces its emotional roots back to the late 1960s counterculture, when songs like Let's Live for Today captured the same live-for-the-moment response to feeling powerless over larger world events. What's changed isn't the impulse. It's the delivery system. In 1969, spending as an emotional release required leaving the house, going to a store, physically handing over cash. Today, it requires one thumbprint from the same device that just showed you the bad news that triggered it. The friction that used to separate the anxious feeling from the purchase has been engineered out of existence. So here's the corrected definition, the one this entire video is built on. Doom spending is not a spending problem. It's an anxiety management problem that happens to use money as its tool. The purchase is not the disorder. It's the symptom of a coping mechanism your brain has learned works, in the short term, at solving a completely different problem, the unbearable feeling of having no control. This distinction matters because it changes what you're supposed to fix. If doom spending is a money problem, the fix is a better spreadsheet. If it's an anxiety management problem, a better spreadsheet does almost nothing because you're treating the output, not the input. This is exactly why budgeting apps feel like they're failing you. They were never built to interrupt an emotional reflex. They were built to track a rational decision. Doom spending isn't a rational decision. It's a nervous system response wearing a shopping cart as a disguise. Consider the scale of what's actually driving this. In a Qualtrics survey conducted on behalf of Intuit Credit Karma in late October 2024, 60% of Americans said they were concerned about the current state of the world and the economy. That's not background noise. That's the majority of the country walking around in a low-grade state of threat perception every single day, often without ever naming it as stress. They just call it the news or how things are right now. And unmanaged, ambient threat perception has to go somewhere. For a growing number of people, it's going into a checkout button. There's a financial psychologist's framing of this that's worth sitting with. Doom spending creates the illusion of control in a world that feels out of control. But the tragic irony is that it produces the opposite effect over time because money spent now is money that isn't available to build the actual security, like homeownership, that would create real control later. That's the trap, stated precisely. The behavior feels like it's solving the powerlessness. It is actually manufacturing more of it on a delay. You feel in control for the 3 minutes between add to cart and order confirmed. Then the bill arrives, the balance drops, and the underlying powerlessness, plus a new layer of shame on top of it, is exactly where you land. Which sets up the loop we're opening up in Chapter 2. Not why people doom spend once, but why the brain keeps reaching for the same broken tool even after it's proven over and over that it doesn't work. It's not a money problem. It's an anxiety relief loop. Let's build the loop piece by piece, because once you can see it as a loop instead of a series of unrelated bad decisions, everything about your spending starts to make a different kind of sense. Stage 1, the trigger. It's rarely the purchase itself that starts this. It's a spike, a headline, a rent notice, a scroll through a feed that reminds you the future feels uncertain. Your nervous system doesn't distinguish between the economy is bad and a tiger is chasing me. Both register as threat. Both demand a response. The problem is that a threat like inflation can't be run from or fought. There's no physical action available that resolves it. So the stress response is left activated with nowhere to discharge. Stage 2. The search for relief. This is where shopping enters. Not because you're careless with money, but because your brain is doing exactly what it's built to do, searching for the fastest available action that will lower the threat signal. And it finds one. Shopping triggers the release of dopamine in reward-related brain regions, including the nucleus accumbens and the ventral tegmental area. That's not a metaphor. That's the same neurochemical circuitry involved in every other reward-seeking behavior your brain has, and it responds to a checkout confirmation the way it would respond to any signal that says danger is past. You did something, you're safe now. Here's the detail almost nobody explains, and it's the one that makes doom spending so hard to interrupt with logic alone. The dopamine spike isn't limited to the moment of purchase. Studies show it can begin before you've bought anything, during the anticipation of the reward itself. That's why doom scrolling and doom spending are so tightly linked. The moment you start browsing, adding to a cart, opening a shopping app after a stressful headline, your brain has already started rewarding you before a single dollar has left your account. You're not weak for feeling better the second you open the app. You're responding exactly the way a reward system is designed to respond. Stage 3. The come down. This is the stage that just don't spend money advice completely ignores. Shopping can provide temporary relief from distress, but it also carries real costs and is followed by a come down, which puts it in a similar category to opioid use, functioning as either therapy or addiction depending on how a person uses it. That comparison isn't there for shock value. It's structurally accurate. Any behavior that produces a fast relief spike followed by a return to baseline or below baseline creates the exact conditions for repetition seeking. You don't crave the purchase itself. You crave the return of that 3-minute window where the threat signal went quiet. Stage 4. The guilt. And this is where the loop closes itself shut, because guilt doesn't cancel the original anxiety. It adds a second layer on top of it. Now you're anxious about the economy and anxious about what you just did about the economy. Two stressors where there used to be one. And your brain, still holding the same relief-seeking machinery that got you here in the first place, now has an even bigger signal to try to quiet down, which sends you looking for relief again. That's not a coincidence. That's the loop, closing itself and resetting to stage 1, except now with a slightly higher baseline of distress than when it started. This is the single biggest reason willpower-based budgeting fails anxious spenders specifically. Willpower operates on the purchase stage of the loop, stage 2. It never touches stage 1, the trigger, or stage 3, the come down, or stage 4, the guilt that reloads the whole cycle. You can white-knuckle your way through stage 2 exactly once, maybe twice. But the trigger is still firing, the unmet need for relief is still there, and eventually the loop wins. Not because you're undisciplined, but because you were only ever fighting 1/4 of the actual mechanism. This reframes the entire premise of the video. Doom spending isn't something that happens to your budget. It's something your nervous system is doing for you, badly, as an attempt to regulate a feeling it was never given a better tool to manage. Which is exactly why, in the next chapter, we're going to name the specific mental shortcut Gen Z uses to make this loop feel not just tolerable, but justified in the moment. A term you've probably used yourself, without realizing it's doing something far more dangerous than it sounds. The Gen Z term that explains the mechanism. Girl math, decoded. In the summer of 2023, a joke went viral. It started, somewhat improbably, on a New Zealand radio show, where hosts jokingly used the phrase to talk through a co-host's recent purchases, and it detonated on TikTok weeks later when a user posted a video framing it as the natural successor to Girl Dinner. From there, it spread everywhere: Instagram, X, group chats, comment sections. The premise was simple and, on its surface, harmless: a set of tongue-in-cheek rules for explaining away spending. Cash doesn't count. A return that gets you money back means you profited. Something under $5 is essentially free. A concert ticket bought months ago is free by the time the concert happens, because enough time has passed that it doesn't feel like current spending anymore. Everyone treated it as a joke, and largely, it was intended as one. But jokes that spread across a billion views usually aren't random. They spread because they're describing something real, something people recognized in themselves the second they saw it named. And what girl math actually describes, stripped of the humor, is one of the most well-documented concepts in behavioral economics around money: mental accounting. Mental accounting is the tendency to mentally sort money into separate categories: rent money, bill money, fund money, and treat each category by a different set of internal rules, even though every dollar is functionally identical the moment it leaves your account. Under this framework, money that feels unexpected, refunded, or outside your normal spending category gets mentally reclassified as free, and free money is money you can spend without the guilt that would normally attach to it. That's the entire trick in one sentence. Girl math isn't bad math. It's a real psychological process that relabels a purchase so it doesn't trigger the part of your brain that would otherwise object. Now connect this directly back to the loop from Chapter 2. Remember Stage 4, the guilt that reloads the whole cycle? Girl math is a preemptive strike on that stage. It's not fixing the anxiety relief loop. It's removing the one checkpoint that might have interrupted it. A spending coach who works specifically on overspending behavior describes this exact mechanism. The practice detaches you from your money, making it feel less real, which in turn detaches you from the financial consequences of the choice you just made. That detachment is the entire function, not the math, the distance. This is why the bridge to this video calls it dangerous, and this is the exact reason. Girl math gives your brain permission to complete the purchase stage of the anxiety relief loop without the friction that would normally make you pause. Every other stage of that loop, the trigger, the dopamine spike, even the come down, happens whether or not you name it. But Stage 4, the guilt, is the one stage that theoretically gives you a moment of resistance, a chance to notice the pattern before it repeats. Girl math specifically dismantles that resistance, in advance, with humor as the delivery mechanism. It's not that you're deceiving yourself about arithmetic. It's that you've built a socially approved, meme-shaped bypass around the one internal alarm that might have slowed the loop down. And that's precisely why it works so well on a generation already primed for it. A professor of accounting who studied the trend put it plainly: everyone constructs internal arguments for why a want is really a need. Girl math simply turns that ordinary self-justification process into something funny and shareable. Making it funny doesn't make it less real. It makes it stickier. A rule you'd reject if a financial advisor told it to you seriously, you'll adopt instantly if a creator delivers it as a punchline, because the joke format disarms the part of you that would normally scrutinize it. To be precise, this isn't a female-specific phenomenon. Despite the name, researchers and commentators alike have pointed out that the underlying rationalization is universal human psychology, not something gendered. The label is cultural branding. The mechanism underneath it belongs to everyone. So here's where that leaves us. You now have the loop, and you now have the specific tool that keeps the loop running smoothly without resistance. The next question is the one most doomed spending content skips entirely. Why does your brain treat a purchase as if it's solving a problem that a purchase cannot actually solve? That's where we go next, and it requires understanding what your brain is actually doing neurologically in the 3 seconds before you tap buy. Why your brain treats a purchase like a painkiller. Here's a claim that sounds like a metaphor and isn't one. Financial anxiety and physical pain are processed, in part, by the same circuitry in your brain. Not similar circuitry. Overlapping circuitry. Researchers have found that physical pain and social pain, things like rejection, exclusion, shame, and the kind of chronic status threat that comes from feeling like you're falling behind, activate the same brain regions responsible for the emotional experience of pain, primarily the dorsal anterior cingulate cortex and the anterior insula. People who describe emotional distress instinctively reach for physical pain language. They say they feel hurt or wounded, and neuroimaging suggests that's not just a figure of speech. The overlap is structural. Now hold that fact next to what doom spending actually is. Go back to the trigger from Chapter 2, the headline about inflation, the rent notice, the scroll that reminds you the future feels unstable. That trigger isn't just stressful in a vague sense. For a lot of people, it functions as a status threat and a control threat simultaneously, a signal that you're falling behind, that you might not be safe, that the people around you might see you as failing. That's not abstract discomfort. Neurologically, it can register in some of the very same pain processing regions that would light up if you'd physically hurt yourself. Which means the question this chapter is actually answering is, if your brain registers financial anxiety as something adjacent to pain, what does it reach for to relieve pain? A painkiller. And the fastest, most available, most culturally normalized painkiller in a modern economy is a purchase. This is why just don't spend money when you're stressed fails as advice in almost the exact way just don't take painkillers when you're in pain would fail as advice for someone in real physical distress. You're not being told to override a preference. You're being asked to sit inside a pain-adjacent state with no available relief, using nothing but willpower for as long as the trigger keeps firing. Most people, not weak people, most people cannot sustain that indefinitely. Eventually, the system finds the fastest exit available. For a huge number of people right now, that exit is a checkout page. There's a deeper piece of the wiring worth naming here because it explains why the relief actually works, even briefly. The same anterior cingulate circuitry involved in processing pain is directly connected to the nucleus accumbens, the reward center we talked about in Chapter 2, and animal research shows this ACC to accumbens pathway is specifically involved in both the experience of pain and the experience of relief from it. In other words, your brain doesn't have two separate systems, one for feeling bad and an unrelated one for feeling good from shopping. It has one integrated circuit where pain and relief sit right next to each other, wired together. A purchase doesn't have to solve your actual problem to flip that circuit toward relief. It just has to register as a reward signal strong enough to compete with the pain signal that's currently active. And a checkout confirmation, with its instant visual and physical feedback, the notification, the packaging, the anticipation of arrival, is an extremely efficient reward signal. This is also why doom spending so rarely responds to logic. You can know, with complete rational clarity, that buying something will not fix inflation, will not fix your job security, will not fix the feeling that you're behind where you're supposed to be. That knowledge lives in your prefrontal cortex. The urge you're fighting lives somewhere else entirely, in a pain and reward circuit that doesn't process spreadsheets, only signals. Telling that circuit this is financially irresponsible is like explaining tax law to your hand while it's already reaching for the ibuprofen. The information is accurate. It's just not being delivered to the part of the system that's making the decision. So the honest, unflinching version of what's happening is this. You are not failing to control your spending. You are medicating a pain signal with the most accessible painkiller your environment has handed you at a scale and speed no previous generation has had access to. That's not an excuse to stop trying to change it. It's the actual starting point for change that works because you cannot out-willpower a pain circuit. You can only give it a different source of relief, or reduce how often the pain signal fires in the first place. Both of those are entirely possible, but neither of them starts with shame, and neither of them starts with a stricter spreadsheet. Which brings us to the trigger side of this equation specifically, because if the pain signal is really coming from somewhere upstream of your bank account, we need to identify exactly where that signal originates before we can do anything about it. And the biggest, most underestimated source of that trigger is sitting in your pocket right now. The Doomscroll-to-Checkout Pipeline, how bad news triggers buying. Up to this point, we've talked about the loop as if the trigger and the purchase happen in two separate places. For most of human history, they did. You'd hear bad news on the radio in the morning, and if you wanted to shop, you had to physically go somewhere later. There was a gap. Time to cool down. Time for the pain signal to fade before the reward-seeking behavior had a chance to act on it. That gap has been engineered out. And it wasn't an accident. Here's the mechanism. Social platforms are not neutral spaces where news happens to sit next to advertising. Algorithmic feeds are built to hold your attention and respond to your engagement patterns in real time, which means the emotional state a platform detects you're in becomes part of what it serves you next. A person scrolling anxiously through economic bad news is, from the platform's perspective, an engaged user in a heightened emotional state. And heightened emotional states are, across the research on impulse spending psychology, one of the strongest known predictors of impulsive purchasing. Studies on social media advertising consistently find that people who use these platforms heavily are significantly more likely to make impulsive purchases than lighter or more deliberate users, largely because of near-constant exposure to targeted ads and influencer content engineered to feel personally relevant in the moment you see it. This is the actual pipeline. Doomscroll opens the pain circuit from Chapter 4. The very same feed, without you leaving the app, without a single moment of friction, then offers the Painkiller. A sale notification. An ad for something that promises comfort, status, or control. The three things the news headline just took away from you. You might also like carousel that shows up not because you search for it, but because the platform's model of your emotional state predicted you'd be more receptive to it right now than you would be an hour from now. There's a specific psychological driver worth naming here because it's doing more work than people realize. Fear of missing out. Research on Gen Z financial wellness and consumer behavior specifically identifies FOMO-based tactics, limited time offers, claims of exclusivity, visible social proof that other people are buying, as significant drivers of impulsive purchases, particularly among younger consumers. Notice what this does when it's layered on top of economic anxiety. The underlying fear is already, I'm falling behind, I don't have control, the future feels uncertain. A FOMO-triggered ad doesn't fight that fear. It aims the exact same fear at a product. Everyone else is getting this. This is going away soon. If you don't act now, you'll be left out again, which is, word for word, the emotional structure of the news trigger that started the loop in the first place. The ad isn't competing with your anxiety. It's recruiting it. There's also a self-control dimension that matters here, and it's more forgiving of you than it sounds. Research out of Finland, surveying over 2,000 young adults, found that people with lower self-control in the moment are specifically more susceptible to social media and targeted advertising as a pathway into impulse buying, not because they lack character, but because self-control is a finite, situational resource, and it's already been spent elsewhere by the time the ad appears. Think back to Chapter 4. Your nervous system just registered something pain-adjacent. Self-regulation resources are already depleted managing that response. The ad isn't meeting you at full strength. It's meeting you seconds after your defenses were already drawn down by the headline sitting directly above it in your feed. So when you tell yourself, I just have no self-control, you are misdiagnosing a design problem as a character flaw. You are using an environment specifically built by teams of people whose job is to shorten the distance between emotional trigger and purchase completion, using data about your actual behavior to do it more precisely than any single ad ever could on its own. The one-click checkout, the saved card, the app that already knows your size, these aren't conveniences that happen to exist alongside doom spending. They are the infrastructure that makes the loop fast enough to complete before your prefrontal cortex gets a vote. This doesn't mean you have zero agency. It means the agency you do have needs to be spent differently than try harder in the moment, because the moment has been engineered against you. What it does mean is that the next trigger in this chain isn't always a headline. Sometimes it's something quieter, more personal, and far more shame-loaded, which is exactly what we're opening up next. The guilt spiral that doesn't just follow doom spending, but actively makes the next round of it worse. The shame spiral. Why guilt makes doom spending worse. Not better. There's a moment almost everyone watching this recognizes. You check your bank account the morning after a doom spending episode. And the thought that shows up isn't, that purchase wasn't a great decision. It's something closer to, what is wrong with me? That distinction between those two thoughts is the entire subject of this chapter, and it's more important than almost anything else in this video. Psychological researchers draw a sharp, well-established line between guilt and shame, and it's not just semantic. Guilt is the evaluation that you did something wrong, a specific behavior tied to a specific moment that you can name and potentially repair. Shame is the evaluation that you are something wrong, a judgment that lands on identity rather than behavior, that doesn't point to an action you can fix, but to a self you apparently can't. I overspent this week is guilt. I'm just bad with money is shame. They feel similar in the moment. They are not remotely similar in what they do to you next. This distinction has been studied most thoroughly in addiction and relapse research, and the findings translate almost exactly onto doom spending because the mechanism underneath both is the same anxiety relief loop we mapped in Chapter 2. The research is consistent. Guilt, when it stays focused on the behavior, can actually support change. It creates accountability and motivates a person to do something differently next time. Shame does the opposite. Chronic shame has been shown to undermine self-worth, weaken a person's sense that change is even possible, and specifically increase the likelihood of relapse into the very behavior the shame was about. Read that again in the context of your bank account. Shame doesn't just feel bad. It makes the behavior it's punishing you for more likely to happen again, not less. That's not a moral failing on your part. That's how shame is documented to function, across an enormous body of research on why people struggle to change entrenched, emotionally driven behaviors. Here's why that happens mechanically. Go back one more time to the loop. The trigger creates a pain-adjacent state. The purchase relieves it briefly. Then the come-down hits, and if what shows up in that come-down is shame rather than guilt, you're no longer processing, I made a choice I want to make differently. You're processing, I am fundamentally the kind of person who can't be trusted with money. That's not a specific, fixable data point. That's a verdict on your entire identity. And a verdict like that doesn't just sit there quietly. Researchers describe shame as something that predicts avoidance, withdrawal, and a kind of global self-devaluation that makes a person want to escape the feeling itself, not just correct the behavior that caused it. And what's the fastest, most available way to escape an unbearable feeling about yourself? The same 3-minute relief mechanism that was available the first time. This is the part almost no doom spending content names directly. Shame doesn't sit outside the loop, watching disapprovingly. Shame becomes a new trigger, feeding directly back into stage 1. You're no longer just doom spending in response to the news. You're now also doom spending in response to how you feel about the last time you doom spent. The loop doesn't just repeat, it compounds because each cycle adds a new layer of evidence that the shame verdict about you is correct, which makes the verdict feel more true, which makes the next relief-seeking purchase feel more inevitable. This is precisely why shame-based finance content, the kind that calls people bad with money or financially irresponsible as a personality description rather than describing a specific pattern, doesn't just fail to help. It can actively deepen the exact behavior it's trying to shame someone out of. It's the equivalent of telling someone in physical pain that their pain proves they're weak and expecting that to make the pain go away. The research on breaking this cycle points consistently in one direction. Self-compassion, not harsher self-judgment, is what predicts someone's actual ability to change the behavior. Not self-compassion as an excuse to stop paying attention, self-compassion as the thing that lets guilt stay guilt, specific and behavior-focused, instead of curdling into shame that attacks your entire sense of who you are. That reframe alone, I did something I want to do differently instead of I am someone who can't be trusted, is not a soft, feel-good add-on to fixing your budget. It is a structural requirement for fixing it, because a budget built on top of an active shame spiral is a budget built on the exact fuel source that keeps the doom spending loop running. Which raises the practical question we've been building toward. If standard budgeting advice doesn't account for any of this, the pain circuit, the algorithmic trigger, the shame spiral, why does it keep failing anxious spenders specifically, even when they follow it correctly? That's what we take apart next. Budget versus restriction. Why traditional budgeting backfires on anxious spenders. Every budgeting app on the market is built on the same underlying assumption. Give someone clear category limits, real-time tracking, and enough visibility into their spending, and rational behavior will follow. That assumption works reasonably well for someone whose spending is driven primarily by planning gaps or simple lack of awareness. It works close to 0% of the time for someone whose spending is driven by the anxiety relief loop we've spent 5 chapters mapping, because a category limit doesn't do anything to the trigger, the pain circuit, or the shame spiral. It only adds a rule. And rules, on top of an unaddressed emotional loop, create a very specific and very well-documented failure pattern. There's a concept from behavioral psychology called the abstinence violation effect, and once you see it, you will not be able to unsee it in your own spending history. It describes what happens after someone breaks a self-imposed rule. A single lapse doesn't stay a single lapse. The intense guilt and self-criticism that follow the lapse are what actually drive the escalation. The belief "I've already failed" is what turns one slip into a full collapse of the entire effort. The rule violation itself was survivable. The internal reaction to violating it is what wasn't. Translate that directly into a budget. You set a $200 grocery limit, a $100 entertainment limit, a $50 fun money limit, clean, reasonable, exactly what every finance creator tells you to do. Then, on a stressful Tuesday, you go $7 over the entertainment category. In a purely rational system, $7 over means you have $7 less somewhere else this month. That's it. That's the entire consequence. But if you're running an anxiety relief loop, $7 over doesn't register as a minor accounting adjustment. It registers as proof. Proof that you can't do this. Proof the shame narrative from Chapter 6 was right. Proof that this whole budgeting attempt was doomed from the start. And once "I've already failed" takes hold, something specific and predictable happens. Since you're apparently already off track, the internal cost of spending further drops to almost nothing. If the month is already ruined, what's another $60? This is precisely how one $7 overage turns into a $300 doom spending episode by Thursday. This is why restriction, specifically, is the wrong tool for an anxious spender, not because limits are inherently bad, but because rigid, all-or-nothing rules are the exact structure that triggers the violation collapse pattern. Behavioral researchers studying this pattern in other domains describe something called learned helplessness setting in after repeated cycles of restriction and collapse. The person starts to believe change simply isn't possible for them and stops trying new approaches altogether, defaulting instead to whatever gave the fastest relief in the past. That's not a coincidence with what we covered in Chapter 6. It's the same mechanism, compounding. There's also a scarcity mindset dimension worth naming, because it explains why restrictive budgets can backfire even before a single rule gets broken. Consumer psychology research shows that a scarcity mindset, the state of constantly focusing on what you lack, what you can't afford, what you have to give up, is associated with heightened stress, anxiety, resentment, and guilt, all of which can undermine the very financial goals the budget was built to support. A budget built entirely around restriction doesn't just risk failing when broken. It actively manufactures more of the anxious, threat-focused state that fuels the original doom spending trigger in the first place. You're not just risking a bad outcome from a strict budget. You're feeding the loop the entire time you're following it correctly. None of this means limits, tracking, or structure are the problem. It means rigid, punitive structure is the problem for a nervous system that's already running a threat response loop. What actually works, based on the same body of research, is a structure with built-in flexibility, one that treats a single overspend as data, not verdict, that has a pre-planned response to a lapse instead of treating a lapse as proof of failure, that reduces the scarcity signal instead of amplifying it. That's a fundamentally different design philosophy than set strict category limits and track everything obsessively, and it's the philosophy we'll build out fully once we've finished mapping the mechanism. Before we get to solutions, though, there's one more piece of the trigger map we haven't covered because the news headline and the algorithmic feed aren't the only things setting this loop off. There are quieter, more personal triggers hiding in an ordinary day that most people never learn to recognize, and naming them is what makes prevention possible instead of just reactive damage control. The 3 doom spending triggers hiding in your daily routine. Everything so far has explained the why. This chapter is about the when because doom spending doesn't strike randomly. It clusters around 3 specific, identifiable conditions, and once you can name them, you can see them coming instead of only understanding them in hindsight. Trigger 1. Decision fatigue, usually after 6 p.m. Self-control isn't a fixed trait you either have or don't. It behaves more like a resource that depletes with use over the course of a day, a concept researchers call ego depletion. Every choice you make, from what to eat for lunch to how to phrase a difficult email, draws from the same limited pool. By evening, that pool is measurably lower, and the research is specific about what happens next. Exercising self-control earlier in the day makes people more prone to impulsivity, procrastination, and defaulting to whatever choice requires the least effort later on, even when that choice isn't the one they'd pick with a full tank. Judges deciding parole cases, executives negotiating contracts, and ordinary shoppers at a checkout line all show the same measurable pattern. The later in a sequence of decisions you are, the more your choices tilt toward impulsive and reactive rather than deliberate. This is precisely why the stereotype of 2 a.m. online shopping and scrolling and buying after a long day is not a coincidence or a punchline. It's the predictable output of a depleted system. You're not weak-willed at 9 p.m. You made dozens, possibly hundreds, of small decisions since you woke up, and the part of your brain responsible for resisting an impulsive purchase has simply run out of the resource it needs to do that job well. Layer the anxiety relief loop from Chapter 2 on top of an already depleted evening, and you have close to ideal conditions for doom spending to occur, not because anything dramatic happened, but because the ordinary friction of a normal day already used up your capacity to resist by the time the trigger arrived. Trigger 2. Unstructured, lonely, or boring hours. Multiple studies on emotional spending triggers identify loneliness and boredom, not just acute stress, as major independent parts of the emotional spending cycle, often quieter and less dramatic than a bad news headline, but just as reliable. Boredom creates its own kind of discomfort, an understimulated brain seeking novelty, and novelty is exactly what a new purchase, or even just browsing a shopping app, reliably provides. Loneliness compounds this, because a purchase can offer a small counterfeit version of the thing's loneliness is actually asking for, a sense of being seen, of mattering, of having made an active choice about your life in a moment that otherwise feels passive and empty. Neither of these triggers involves anxiety about the news at all. They're quieter, more personal versions of the exact same pain relief mechanism from Chapter 4, which is why I only doom spend when I'm stressed about the economy, is often an incomplete self-diagnosis. The bored Sunday afternoon and the lonely Tuesday night are running the identical loop, just with a different opening trigger. Trigger 3. The windfall moment. This is the trigger that connects directly back to Chapter 3. Payday, a tax refund, a bonus, a cash gift. Any money that arrives outside your normal, expected budget flow gets mentally filed differently than money you've been carefully tracking all month. This is mental accounting in its purest form. Money is treated as belonging to different, non-interchangeable categories depending on where it came from, rather than being evaluated as simply more or less of the same resource. A windfall specifically gets coded, almost automatically, as safe to spend without the usual scrutiny, which is exactly the psychological terrain that girl math was built to describe. Recall the tax refund data from earlier in this video. A majority of Gen Z respondents in a 2025 survey said they planned to doom spend their tax refund specifically, rather than save or apply it toward debt. That's not a coincidence of timing. A windfall arrives already pre-labeled, in your own mind, as money that doesn't quite count, which strips away the one psychological checkpoint that might have otherwise slowed a doom spending episode down. Notice what these 3 triggers have in common. None of them require a crisis. No layoff, no market crash, no dramatic headline. An ordinary Thursday evening, a quiet Sunday afternoon, or a Friday paycheck notification is enough, on its own, to open the exact same loop we've spent this entire video mapping. Which means prevention isn't about waiting for the news to calm down. It's about recognizing your own personal trigger windows before they arrive. There's one more distinction we need to draw before we move into solutions, because there's a specific type of doom spending that gets misdiagnosed constantly, spending that looks identical on the surface, but is being driven by an entirely different emotional engine, which means it needs a completely different fix. Revenge spending versus doom spending, the difference that changes your fix. Here's a mix-up that causes a lot of people to apply the wrong fix to their own spending. Revenge spending and doom spending get used interchangeably online, but they are pointed in opposite directions in time, and that difference changes almost everything about what actually helps. The clearest distinction comes down to timing and orientation. Revenge spending happens in the aftermath of a stressful or restrictive period. It's a reaction to something that already happened. Doom spending is driven by fear of what's coming. It's a reaction to something that hasn't happened yet and might not. Revenge spending has a well-documented origin point. The COVID-19 lockdowns, when people were denied ordinary access to shopping, travel, and experiences for an extended stretch, and then spent in a surge once restrictions lifted. The underlying psychological driver here has a name: psychological reactance, the pushback response that shows up specifically when something is taken away or prohibited. Revenge spending, in its purest form, is retaliation against restriction. It says, "I was denied this, and now I'm taking it back." The emotional charge is backward-facing, grief, frustration, or a sense of lost time, and the purchase functions as an attempt to reclaim something specific that was withheld. Doom spending runs on an entirely different engine, and we've spent 8 chapters mapping it. It's not reclaiming a lost past, it's medicating an uncertain future. It says, "I don't know what's coming, and I have no way to control it, so I'll control this one small thing right now." There's no specific restriction being avenged. There's an ongoing, low-grade, unresolved threat: inflation, job security, the sense of being permanently behind, that never fully goes away, which is exactly why doom spending doesn't resolve the way revenge spending does. Revenge spending has a natural endpoint. Eventually, the lost time feels sufficiently reclaimed, and the surge tapers off. Doom spending has no such endpoint built in, because the underlying fear it's responding to is ambient and ongoing rather than tied to a single, resolvable event. This is exactly why the fix has to be different. If you're dealing with genuine revenge spending, spending tied to a specific period of real deprivation, with an identifiable thing I was denied behind it, the fix often involves consciously, deliberately planning for a limited, budgeted version of that reclaiming, so the need gets acknowledged and satisfied on purpose instead of erupting unplanned. You give the reactance a controlled outlet instead of an unlimited one. But if what you're actually dealing with is doom spending, and for the anxious, economically uncertain audience this video is built for, that's the far more common diagnosis. Planning a controlled splurge doesn't work because there's no specific deprivation being reclaimed. The threat is ongoing and formless. A pre-planned splurge does nothing to address a fear that renews itself every time you open your phone. Applying the revenge spending fix to doom spending is like scheduling a single cheat meal to fix a chronic, ongoing stress response. It might feel good once, but the mechanism generating the behavior hasn't been touched at all. Here's the diagnostic question worth asking yourself the next time you catch an urge building. Am I trying to get back something I lost? Or am I trying to numb something I'm afraid of? If it's the former, you're likely dealing with a genuine revenge spending impulse, and a planned, boundaried version of that reclaiming is a legitimate tool. If it's the latter, if the honest answer is closer to, "I don't even know exactly what I'm afraid of, I just needed the feeling to stop," you're dealing with the anxiety relief loop this entire video has been mapping, and the fix isn't a planned splurge. It's addressing the loop itself. The trigger, the pain circuit, the shame spiral, and the rigid restriction backfire we've covered across the last 8 chapters. Most people carry a blend of both, which is part of why doom spending is so hard to diagnose from the outside. A single purchase can be motivated by genuine, specific deprivation and by ambient future fear at the same time. But naming which force is doing the heavier lifting, purchase by purchase, is what makes the difference between a fix that actually works and a fix that only works for the wrong problem. We now have the full mechanism: the trigger, the pain circuit, the algorithmic pipeline, the shame spiral, the restriction backfire, the hidden daily triggers, and the diagnostic line between doom spending and its closest lookalike. That's the complete anatomy. Everything from here forward is about what to actually do with it, starting with the single most common piece of advice that sounds right and fails almost every anxious spender who tries it. Why? Just track your spending. Does it work? And what does? If you've ever asked yourself, why do I overspend even when I know exactly where the money's going? This chapter is the answer. If you've tried literally every budgeting app on the market and still ended up here, watching this video, this chapter is for you specifically. Because the advice isn't wrong, exactly. It's aimed at the wrong layer of the problem. Tracking your spending is an awareness tool. It answers the question, where did my money go? That's genuinely useful information for someone whose spending problem is a visibility problem. But everything we've covered across this video shows that doom spending isn't a visibility problem. You already know in the moment roughly what you're spending and roughly why. Awareness was never the missing ingredient. The missing ingredient is what happens between the awareness and the action, and there's a specific, well-established finding in psychological research that explains exactly why awareness alone loses that fight. Researchers studying self-regulation found something counterintuitive. When someone is in an emotionally distressed state, regulating that distress takes priority over every other form of self-control, including impulse control. In other words, when you feel bad enough, just do it wins even when it works against your own stated goals. This is precisely the mechanism from Chapter 4, dressed in different language. Your prefrontal cortex, the part of your brain doing the tracking, the categorizing, the I shouldn't do this reasoning, is not the part in charge during an active anxiety relief loop. The part in charge is the part trying to make the bad feeling stop, immediately, by whatever means is fastest. A tracking app lives entirely in the reasoning brain. The urge lives somewhere else. That's the mismatch, and it's why so many people can recite their own spending categories in perfect detail and still watch themselves overspend in exactly the pattern they just described to you. So, what actually works? Not more tracking. Less distance between the moment of temptation and a pre-decided response, because the entire problem with willpower in the moment is that it requires the depleted, distressed, reasoning brain to win a fight in real time. The better approach removes the need for that fight to happen at all. The first tool, implementation intentions. This is a well-studied behavior change technique built around simple if-then planning, deciding in advance exactly what you'll do when a specific trigger shows up, so the response becomes closer to automatic rather than something you have to reason your way through under stress. A meta-analysis pooling dozens of studies found implementation intentions produced a meaningfully strong effect on whether people actually followed through on their goals, because the plan gets encoded before the emotional state hits, not during it. Applied to doom spending, this looks like deciding in advance. When I feel the urge to shop after reading bad news, I close the app and text a specific friend instead, rather than trying to invent a disciplined response from scratch at 11 p.m. while your reasoning brain is offline. The second tool, engineered friction. A growing trend researchers and financial writers now call friction maxing, involves deliberately reinserting the obstacles that one-click checkout removed, deleting saved cards, logging out after each session, turning off one-tap purchasing, specifically because the entire danger of frictionless shopping is how fast a purchase can complete before your reasoning brain even gets a vote. This directly counters the Doomscroll-to-Checkout Pipeline from Chapter 5. If the algorithm's advantage is speed, your defense has to be reinserting time. A single deleted saved card can be the entire difference between an impulse and a pause. One of the simplest ways to stop impulse spending before it starts. The third tool, a structural cooling off period. Financial researchers commonly recommend a fixed waiting period, often 24 hours, before completing any non-essential purchase above a set amount, not because willpower will magically appear in that window, but because it forces the decision out of the emotionally activated moment and into a calmer one, where the reasoning brain actually has a chance to weigh in. This isn't about resisting temptation. It's about changing when the decision gets made, so it's made by the part of your brain equipped to make it well. Notice what all three tools have in common. None of them are about trying harder, feeling more guilty, or being more aware. All three change the structure of the moment, so the decision doesn't depend on winning an unfair fight against a distressed, depleted nervous system in real time. That's the actual upgrade from track your spending, not more visibility, but a system engineered around the mechanism we spent the first 9 chapters mapping. This sets up the real work of the rest of this video, taking the entire mechanism, the loop, the pain circuit, the triggers, the shame spiral, and building it into a single, coherent reframe for what a budget is even for, starting with the question that undoes almost everything traditional budgeting gets wrong about anxious spenders. Breaking the loop, the anxiety-first reframe for real budgets. If you've been searching for how to budget with anxiety instead of against it, this is the reframe. Here's the reframe this entire video has been building toward, and it's really a personal finance psychology problem before it's a numbers problem. Budgeting for anxious spenders isn't a spreadsheet exercise. It's a nervous system management tool that happens to also track money. If you design it like a spreadsheet first and a nervous system tool second, it will keep failing you in exactly the ways we've spent 10 chapters explaining. Design it the other way around, and something changes. There are 4 structural principles that fall directly out of everything we've covered. None of them are complicated. All of them are usually missing from standard budgeting advice, precisely because standard budgeting advice was never built with the anxiety relief loop in mind. Principle 1. Build in a buffer, not a wall. Chapter 7 showed exactly what happens when a rigid category limit gets broken. The abstinence violation effect turns a small overage into a full collapse. The fix isn't looser limits, it's a designated flex category, planned in advance, specifically sized to absorb an emotional spending episode without triggering the "I've already failed" thought that reloads the whole loop. If 10% of your monthly spending is pre-labeled buffer, no explanation needed, then a doom spending episode inside that buffer isn't a violation. It's the system working as designed. That single reframe removes the exact psychological trigger that turns a slip into a spiral. Principle 2. Attach every dollar to a value, not just a category. This is the underlying insight behind a recent shift in how people talk about budgeting publicly, sometimes called loud budgeting, which reframes financial boundaries around what you're actively choosing to prioritize, rather than what you're being denied. A behavioral economist studying the trend describes it as purposeful storytelling. Instead of reciting line-item restrictions, you frame each choice around what it protects. I'm not eating out this week because I'm building toward a trip that matters more to me right now. This matters mechanically, not just emotionally, because Chapter 4 showed that doom spending is partly an attempt to regain a felt sense of control. A values-attached budget gives you a different, more durable source of that same feeling, the sense that you're actively steering toward something rather than passively being restricted from something. You're replacing the 3-minute counterfeit control of a purchase with an ongoing, real sense of authorship over your own life. Principle 3. Separate the behavior from the identity, on purpose, every time. This goes directly back to the guilt versus shame distinction from Chapter 6. Every time you review your spending weekly, not daily, so you're not reviewing it in an activated state, the internal language matters. "I overspent this category this week" keeps the review in guilt territory, which supports change. "I always do this. I can't be trusted with money" tips into shame territory, which predicts more of the behavior it's criticizing. This isn't a soft add-on. It's a load-bearing part of the system, because a review process that generates shame is a review process that's quietly manufacturing your next doom spending trigger. Principle 4. Plan your trigger response before the trigger arrives. This is the implementation intention tool from Chapter 10, built directly into the budget itself rather than treated as a separate willpower exercise. Your budget should have a written, specific answer to the question, "What do I do when I feel the urge, and where?" Not a vague intention to be better, but an actual if-then. If a doom scroll session starts building the urge, then the phone goes down and a 2-minute walk happens before any app opens. If a stressful evening hits after 8 p.m., then non-essential purchases wait until morning by default. No exceptions negotiated in the moment. The plan does the deciding in advance, so the depleted, distressed brain from Chapter 8 doesn't have to. Notice what this reframed budget is actually doing, structurally. It's addressing the trigger, Principle 4, the pain relief substitute, Principle 2, the shame spiral, Principle 3, and the restriction collapse pattern, Principle 1. The 4 load-bearing pieces of the entire mechanism this video has mapped. It's not a stricter version of the same tool that already failed you. It's a different tool, built for the nervous system you actually have instead of the purely rational one traditional budgeting assumes. There's also a social dimension worth naming honestly. Research from the American Psychological Association has found that a significant share of people feel embarrassed discussing money with others at all, across nearly every age group, and that silence is part of what keeps shame alive in the loop from Chapter 6. Whether or not loud budgeting as a public trend appeals to you personally, the underlying mechanism it's built on is real. Naming your financial boundaries out loud, even just to one trusted person, reduces the isolation that shame depends on to keep operating. None of these 4 principles are a one-time fix. They're a system that has to survive contact with an actual bad week, which is exactly the stress test we need to run next, because a budget that only works when everything is calm was never built to handle the person watching this video in the first place. Building a budget that survives a bad mental health week. Every budget we've built so far in this video assumes a baseline level of functioning, enough energy to plan, enough clarity to follow through on a trigger plan, enough capacity to review spending without spiraling into shame. Most weeks, that baseline holds. But if you're the person this video was made for, you already know some weeks it doesn't. And a budget that only works when you're at full capacity isn't actually a functioning system. It's a system with a single point of failure built directly into the exact weeks you need it most. Here's why this deserves its own chapter instead of a footnote. The relationship between financial stress and low mood runs in both directions. Financial stress is linked to increased depressive symptoms, and depressive states, in turn, are associated with measurable impairments in exactly the cognitive functions budgeting depends on: attention, working memory, and executive planning. That's not a character issue. It's a documented, bidirectional pattern. During a genuinely difficult stretch, burnout, a depressive episode, an anxiety flare, the part of your brain responsible for intertemporal decision-making, meaning the ability to weigh a future consequence against a present impulse, is operating with less available capacity than it normally has. Financial researchers studying this connection describe two common, opposite-looking responses during these periods. Some people respond with impulsive spending, using purchases as distraction or as an attempt to feel something other than numb. Others respond with avoidance, letting bills go unopened, and financial decisions pile up because even opening the app feels like too much. Both responses feed the same cycle. Both are also, critically, not moral failures. They're what a taxed executive function system defaults to when the far more effortful task of careful, values-aligned financial planning simply isn't available that week. Which means the design task here isn't try harder during a hard week. It's building a version of your system in advance that requires almost nothing from the depleted version of you. This is what a low-capacity protocol looks like structurally. First, reduce the number of decisions your bad week self has to make to near zero. Not budget carefully this week. Pre-decide, while you're at baseline, exactly what a bad week defaults to. A fixed, small amount automatically routed to essentials. A single spending category that's simply off-limits, no decision required, rather than something to weigh case by case, because decision-making itself is the resource in short supply, not just willpower. The fewer live decisions a bad week demands, the less that week has to lean on capacity you don't currently have. Second, separate, reviewing what happened from the week itself. Trying to track and course-correct spending in real time during a low-capacity stretch adds exactly the kind of cognitive load that's already scarce. Let the week happen, protected by the pre-decided defaults from step one, and do any review once capacity has returned, not as an act of catching yourself, but as a scheduled, unemotional check-in days later, when the reviewing brain is actually available to do the job well. Third, build a specific, gentler script for the guilt versus shame moment that follows a hard week, because it will follow. Not, I completely failed at this, but something closer to, this was a hard week, my capacity was lower than usual, and the buffer I built for exactly this situation did its job. This isn't self-indulgence. It's the practical application of Chapter 6, because if a hard week gets processed through shame instead of through this kind of grounded accounting, the shame itself becomes the next trigger, and the whole loop restarts with an added layer. One honest note belongs here. If what you're noticing as you watch this isn't just an occasional hard week but a longer, heavier pattern, persistent low mood, ongoing difficulty functioning, spending that feels tied to something bigger than any budget can address, that's worth bringing to a doctor or a therapist directly, not just a spreadsheet. A budget can absorb a rough week. It was never designed to be the treatment for something that needs real clinical support, and there's no shame in that distinction either. For everyone else, the practical takeaway is this: resilience isn't built by hoping the hard weeks don't come. It's built by designing in advance for the version of you that shows up when they do. That's the final piece of the mechanism, and it's what makes the difference between a system that works for a month and one that actually holds for years, which is exactly where we're headed to close this out. The long-term system, how to doom-proof your finances for good. We've spent 12 chapters taking apart a mechanism that most content treats as a single-sentence definition. Before we close, it's worth being precise about what doom-proofing your finances actually means, because it doesn't mean eliminating anxiety. Nobody is offering you a version of the economy that stops being uncertain. What it means is building a system robust enough that the anxiety no longer automatically converts into spending, because every stage of the loop that used to run unopposed now has something in its way. But there's one long-term move we haven't discussed yet, and it deserves to close this video because it doesn't just interrupt the loop, it shrinks the trigger itself. Go all the way back to Chapter 1. The doom scroll headline registers as a threat specifically because it activates a felt sense of powerlessness about your financial future. Most of what we've built since then addresses what happens after that threat signal fires. This last piece addresses the signal's intensity in the first place. The single most evidence-backed long-term move is a small, dedicated emergency fund, and the number required to feel the difference is far lower than most people assume. Research on the psychology of saving has found that even a modest emergency fund, in the range of $400 to $1,000, measurably reduces financial anxiety and interrupts the debt cycle that keeps unexpected expenses spiraling into high-interest borrowing. A large-scale study from Vanguard's behavioral economics team found that people with at least $2,000 in emergency savings reported financial well-being scores roughly a fifth higher than those with none, and, notably, they also reported spending less mental time and attention on money worries day to day. That second finding matters more than it sounds like it should, because it's a direct answer to the trigger from Chapter 5. Less ambient financial preoccupation means fewer moments where a stray headline finds an already activated nervous system to land on. Here's why this specific move outperforms almost everything else on a long-term horizon. It doesn't require you to win a willpower fight in the moment, ever. Behavioral researchers studying the persistent gap between people's stated savings intentions and their actual savings behavior consistently point to the same fix: automation. Take the decision out of the moment entirely, route a fixed small amount automatically before you ever see it, and the present bias, ego depletion, and decision fatigue dynamics from Chapter 8 simply never get a chance to intervene because there's no live decision left for them to sabotage. This is the same design principle from Chapter 12's low-capacity protocol, applied to your entire financial life. Build the good outcome into the structure, so it doesn't depend on you being at full strength every single time. One caution worth naming honestly, because this video has spent this much time on nuance. Financial therapists also describe a pattern called stress saving, where the same anxiety that fuels doom spending can instead fuel compulsive, fear-driven oversaving, hoarding far beyond any real need, at the cost of quality of life or investment growth. The goal is never save obsessively instead of spending anxiously. Both are the same nervous system responding to the same underlying uncertainty, just pointed in different directions. The actual target is a defined, sufficient buffer. 3 to 6 months of essential expenses is the commonly cited range, adjusted for your specific stability, funded automatically, then left alone. Enough to blunt the trigger. Not an infinite, anxiety-driven pursuit of more. So here's the complete system, stated plainly, one final time. You're not bad with money. You have a nervous system that registers financial uncertainty as something close to physical pain, that reaches for the fastest available relief when that pain fires, that gets a cultural permission slip to skip the one internal checkpoint that might slow it down, and that lives inside an environment engineered to erase the gap between trigger and purchase. None of that is a character flaw. All of it is addressable, not through more shame, not through stricter restriction, but through a system built around how you actually work, a buffer instead of a wall, values instead of pure restriction, guilt instead of shame, a pre-decided plan instead of in-the-moment willpower, a low-capacity mode for the weeks that need one, and a small, automated cushion that shrinks the trigger at its source. That's not a quick fix. It's a rebuild. But it's the first one built for the brain you actually have. If any part of this felt uncomfortably familiar, the $7 overage that turned into a $300 night, the girl math that let you off the hook a little too easily, the bank account you've been avoiding checking, that recognition is the actual starting point here. Not shame. Recognition. You don't need to fix all 13 chapters of this at once. Pick one piece, the buffer category, the if-then trigger plan, the automated $100 a month, and let that be the whole assignment for now. If this gave you a different way to think about your own spending, subscribe for the next deep dive in the series, and drop in the comments which chapter hit closest to home. I read them, and it shapes what gets covered next. Here's the promise this video made, and here's it kept. You can't stick to a budget because nobody ever showed you the mechanism. Not because you lack discipline. Not because you're bad with money. Because a pain signal was firing, a relief valve was one tap away, and every piece of advice you'd been given was aimed at the wrong layer of the problem entirely. That's the shift. Stop asking, why can't I control myself? Start asking, what triggered this, and what does my system do about it before I even feel the pull? So here's what this weekend actually looks like. Not a full financial overhaul, one move. Open your banking app and set up one automatic transfer, even $5, into a separate account it doesn't touch. That's the buffer from Chapter 11, Live in Under 2 Minutes. Then write down one if-then plan on a sticky note, phone, wherever you'll see it. If I feel the urge after doom scrolling, then I close the app and wait until morning. That's it. That's the whole assignment. You now understand the loop better than most financial advisors explain it. But understanding a mechanism and dismantling one of its favorite disguises are two different skills, and there's a specific piece of this puzzle we've only touched on so far. Chapter 3 named it. It's the joke everyone's laughing at, the girl math that feels harmless, that feels like it's just having fun with a receipt. It isn't harmless. It's the exact cognitive loophole that lets the loop you just spent this entire video learning to close, walk right back in through the front door, wearing a punchline as a disguise. If you actually want this to hold, not just this week but permanently, that's the next video. Click it now while the mechanism is still fresh, and let's take that loophole apart completely.